Imagine waking up every morning knowing that today could be your last. Not because of war, not because of disease, but because your Lord decides your life has no value. This was the reality for over 90% of medieval Europe's population. You're about to discover why being born a peasant in medieval times was essentially a death sentence wrapped in chains. The horrors you're about to hear aren't fiction. They're the documented reality of how the feudal system crushed human souls for centuries. Welcome back to Medieval Sins, where we unveil history's darkest secrets. Today we're descending into the nightmare that was peasant life in medieval Europe, a world where fear wasn't just an emotion, it was a survival tool. The year is 1347. You're a peasant in rural England, and you've just heard the church bells toll at dawn. But these aren't calling you to prayer. They're announcing that your neighbor has been found dead in the fields, his body bearing the marks of his Lord's justice. His crime? Stealing a handful of grain to feed his starving children. This wasn't unusual. This was Tuesday. Let's shatter a common misconception right away. Medieval peasants weren't simple farmers living off the land. They were human property in a system so brutal that it makes modern human trafficking look merciful by comparison. The feudal system was built on a foundation of legalized slavery disguised as social order. At the bottom of this pyramid of oppression sat the peasants, approximately 90% of the population, who existed solely to generate wealth for their social superiors through backbreaking labor and crushing taxation. When a peasant was born, they weren't just born into poverty. They were born into a legal status that stripped them of almost every human right we take for granted today. They couldn't leave their lord's land without permission. They couldn't marry without approval. They couldn't even die without their lord's consent to burial. The Latin term servus, from which we get the word serf, literally meant slave. These weren't tenant farmers or employees. They were human livestock, and their lords treated them accordingly. The financial reality of peasant life was a carefully constructed trap designed to ensure permanent servitude. Let's break down the mathematics of medieval exploitation. A typical peasant family worked strips of land totaling about 15 to 30 acres, depending on the region and the lord's generosity. Sounds reasonable, right? Wrong. Here's the catch. They only kept about 1/3 of what they produced. The remaining 2/3 went to their lord through various forms of taxation and obligation. There was the gaffol, a direct tax on their produce, the boon work, unpaid labor they owed to their lord's personal lands, the heriot, a death tax that claimed their best livestock when they died, the merchet, a payment required for their daughters to marry. But it gets worse. Peasants were also required to pay the church a tithe, typically 10% of their remaining produce. They had to pay to use the Lord's mill to grind their grain, the Lord's oven to bake their bread, and the Lord's brewing equipment to make their ale. By the time all these obligations were met, a peasant family was often left with barely enough food to survive the winter. And if the harvest was bad, they starved, while their lord's granaries remained full. Famine wasn't an occasional tragedy in medieval peasant life. It was a recurring nightmare that haunted every decision. Historical records show that severe famines struck most regions of Europe every 7 to 10 years, with lesser food shortages occurring almost annually. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 provides us with a horrifying window into peasant suffering. Chronicles from the period describe scenes that would make hardened soldiers weep. Peasants were found dead in their fields, their mouths stuffed with grass and bark they'd tried to eat. Children were abandoned by parents who couldn't feed them. In some regions, cannibalism became so common that it was specifically mentioned in legal documents. But here's the truly sickening part. While peasants were dying of starvation, Their lords continued to export grain to other regions for profit. The feudal system wasn't just indifferent to peasant suffering. It was actively structured to prioritize lords' profits over peasant lives. During the Great Famine, the price of grain increased by 800% in some regions. Lords who controlled the grain supply became incredibly wealthy, while peasants sold their children into slavery for a handful of bread. This wasn't a failure of the system. This was the system working exactly as designed. The medieval legal system was essentially a tool of terror designed to keep peasants in line through fear. Lords held what was called high justice, the right to execute peasants for crimes both real and imagined. The legal principle of might makes right was literally codified into law. A lord's word was automatically considered more truthful than a peasant's, regardless of evidence. If a peasant was accused of theft, adultery, or rebellion, they had virtually no legal recourse. The punishments were designed to be public spectacles of horror. Peasants were hanged, drawn and quartered, burned alive, or subjected to torture devices specifically designed to maximize suffering. The gibbet, a metal cage where condemned peasants were left to die of exposure, was a common sight in medieval villages, serving as a constant reminder of what happened to those who defied the system. Trial by ordeal was another favorite method of medieval justice. Peasants accused of crimes were forced to carry red-hot iron bars, plunge their hands into boiling water, or undergo other tortures. If they survived without permanent injury, they were considered innocent. If they were maimed or died, they were guilty. The system was literally designed to punish the innocent and justify the cruelty. The legal status of serfdom was perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of peasant life. Serfs weren't just economically exploited, they were legally defined as non-persons. A serf couldn't own property, enter into contracts, or even testify in court against a free person. They were bought and sold with the land they worked, like livestock. When a lord sold his estate, the serfs were included in the transaction, often listed in the deed alongside the cattle and farming equipment. The psychological impact of this legal dehumanization cannot be overstated. Serfs were constantly reminded that they were considered less than human by the society they lived in. Their lords had the legal right to beat them, rape their daughters, and kill them for minor infractions. The concept of chevage, a tax serfs had to pay for the privilege of living, perfectly encapsulates the cruelty of the system. Serfs were literally charged rent for existing, and if they couldn't pay, they could be lawfully killed. The physical reality of peasant work was designed to break both body and spirit. Peasants worked from dawn to dusk, 7 days a week, with only major religious holidays providing any respite. The tools they used were deliberately kept primitive and inefficient. Lords refused to invest in better equipment because efficient tools would reduce the amount of labor required, which would reduce their control over the peasant population. Peasants plowed their fields with wooden plows that barely scratched the surface of the soil. They harvested grain with sickles that required them to bend over for hours at a time. They threshed grain by hand with flails, a process so backbreaking that it commonly caused permanent spinal damage. The physical toll was devastating. Archaeological evidence shows that medieval peasants suffered from severe malnutrition, arthritis, and repetitive stress injuries. Their average lifespan was about 35 years, and most of those years were spent in constant physical pain. But the psychological toll was perhaps even worse. Peasants were forced to watch their lords live in luxury while they struggled to survive. They saw their children die of diseases that could be cured with better food and medicine, resources that their lords had in abundance but refused to share. Violence wasn't just a possibility in peasant life. It was a constant, looming presence that shaped every decision and interaction. Lords maintained their power through systematic brutality that would make modern war criminals blush. The right of the first night, jus prime noctis, gave lords the legal right to rape peasant brides on their wedding night. While historians debate how commonly this was actually practiced, the very existence of such a law demonstrates the absolute power lords held over peasant bodies. Lords also maintained private armies of knights and men-at-arms whose primary job was to terrorize the peasant population. These weren't soldiers in the modern sense. They were professional thugs whose job was to collect taxes through violence and intimidation. The practice of chevauche, organized raids on peasant villages, was considered a legitimate military tactic. Lords would send their knights to burn peasant homes, destroy crops, and kill livestock as punishment for real or imagined slights. These raids were specifically designed to target civilians and create maximum suffering. When the Black Death arrived in Europe in 1347, it initially seemed like it might offer peasants relief from their suffering. The massive population decline meant that surviving peasants were in high demand, and many lords were forced to offer better working conditions to keep their labor force. For a brief moment, peasants had leverage. They could demand higher wages, better food, and more freedom. Some even managed to escape serfdom entirely, fleeing to towns where their labor was desperately needed. But the lords' response was swift and brutal. They passed laws like the Statute of Laborers in England, which made it illegal for peasants to demand higher wages or leave their lord's land. The penalties for violating these laws included branding, imprisonment, and death. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 was the inevitable result of this oppression. When peasants finally rose up against their lords, demanding basic human rights and an end to serfdom, the response was genocidal. Thousands of peasants were slaughtered, their leaders were tortured to death, and the surviving rebels were forced back into even harsher conditions than before. The medieval church, which peasants might have looked to for comfort and hope, was instead another source of oppression and fear. The church actively supported the feudal system, preaching that peasants' suffering was God's will and that rebellion against their lords was a sin punishable by eternal damnation. The concept of the three estates, those who fight, those who pray, and those who work, was used to justify peasant oppression as part of God's natural order. Peasants were taught that their suffering in this life would be rewarded in the next, but only if they accepted their fate without complaint. The church collected its own taxes from peasants, often taking food from the mouths of starving children to fund the construction of magnificent cathedrals and the luxurious lifestyles of clergy. Parish priests, who came from the peasant class themselves, were caught between serving their communities and serving their ecclesiastical superiors. The fear of hell was used as a tool of control. Peasants were told that stealing food to feed their children, questioning their lord's authority, or even expressing anger at their suffering was a mortal sin that would condemn them to eternal torture. Perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of peasant life was the absolute certainty that things would never improve. A peasant born into serfdom would die in serfdom. Their children would be serfs. Their grandchildren would be serfs. The system was designed to crush hope itself. Peasants lived in a world where every aspect of their existence was controlled by others. They couldn't choose where to live, what to eat, whom to marry, or even when to die. They were born into a prison made of law, tradition, and violence, and escape was virtually impossible. The rare peasants who did manage to escape serfdom often faced even worse fates. They became outlaws, living in forests and swamps, constantly hunted by their former lords. They were excluded from society, unable to enter towns or receive help from other peasants who feared retaliation. The feudal system's oppression of peasants lasted for centuries, and its effects can still be seen today. The concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a few, the use of legal systems to oppress the poor, and the normalization of extreme inequality all have their roots in medieval feudalism. But perhaps the most lasting legacy is the way the system convinced people that extreme inequality was natural and inevitable. The idea that some people are simply born to rule while others are born to serve became so deeply embedded in European culture that it survived the end of feudalism itself. The peasants' constant fear wasn't just about immediate physical threats, it was about the psychological realization that they were trapped in a system that viewed them as subhuman. They lived in terror, not just of death, but of the knowledge that their lives had no value to those who controlled their fate. The medieval peasant's life was a masterclass in systematic oppression. Every aspect of the feudal system was designed to extract maximum labor while providing minimum resources for survival. Peasants lived in constant fear because they understood, with brutal clarity, that their lords viewed them as expendable resources rather than human beings. The next time you hear someone romanticize the medieval period, remember the 90% of the population who lived in conditions that would shock modern observers. Remember the peasants who died face down in muddy fields, their bodies broken by endless labor and their spirits crushed by systematic dehumanization. Their fear was rational. Their suffering was real, and their stories deserve to be told, not to glorify the past, but to remind us how easily civilizations can slip into systems that treat human beings as disposable commodities. The medieval peasant's constant fear wasn't paranoia. It was the logical response to living in a world designed to crush the human spirit. In our next episode, we'll explore how this system of oppression eventually led to some of the most brutal uprisings in human history. Until then, remember, the darkest chapters of history aren't just stories from the past. They're warnings about what happens when we allow systems of oppression to take root and flourish. A real historical account from the 1381 English peasants' revolt picture this. It's June 1381, and England is about to witness one of the most dramatic uprisings in medieval history. At the center of this storm stands a man whose name would echo through the centuries, Wat Tyler, a peasant craftsman who had finally reached his breaking point. Tyler's story isn't just another tale from the history books. It's the real-life embodiment of everything we've discussed about peasant oppression. His life, his struggle, and ultimately his death paint a vivid picture of what happened when the feudal system's cruelty finally pushed people too far. Historical chronicles tell us that Wat Tyler came from Kent, possibly from towns like Dartford or Maidstone. Some sources suggest he may have been from Essex, near Colchester. What we know for certain is that he was a craftsman, likely a Tyler, which is how he got his surname. Tyler had probably served as an archer in the 100 Years' War campaigns in France, which was common for men of his class. He'd seen the world beyond his village, witnessed the wealth and power of the nobility, and understood just how expendable peasants were in the eyes of their lords. When Tyler returned to England, he found a country where the gap between rich and poor had grown even wider. The Black Death had killed nearly half the population. But instead of improving conditions for survivors, the ruling class had doubled down on oppression. The immediate cause of the revolt was the poll tax, a flat tax of 4 pence per adult, regardless of wealth or social status. Now, 4 pence might not sound like much, but for a peasant family already giving 2/3 of their produce to their lord, it was catastrophic. Let me put this in perspective. A typical peasant earned maybe 12 pence a year in actual cash. The poll tax alone would consume 1/3 of their entire monetary income. For families already living on the edge of starvation, this tax was literally a death sentence. But the poll tax was just the final straw. Tyler and his fellow peasants had endured decades of increasing oppression. They'd watched their children die of hunger while their lords exported grain for profit. They'd seen their daughters subjected to the Lord's sexual demands. They'd buried friends who'd been executed for stealing bread. In May 1381, Tyler's patience, along with thousands of other peasants, finally snapped. The revolt began in Essex and Kent, spreading like wildfire across southeastern England. Tyler emerged as the leader of the Kentish rebels, and his charisma and determination quickly made him the face of the entire uprising. The rebels' first target was Rochester Castle, where they freed prisoners and destroyed tax records. But this wasn't random violence. It was calculated resistance. Tyler and his followers specifically targeted the symbols and instruments of their oppression: tax collectors, legal documents, and the bureaucrats who enforced the feudal system. On June 10th, Tyler led his army to Canterbury, the seat of religious power in England. There, they executed several prominent officials and freed prisoners from the castle. The rebels also forced the monks to swear loyalty to King Richard and the Commons. The Canterbury raid revealed the peasants' sophisticated understanding of power structures. They knew that the church was complicit in their oppression, preaching submission while collecting tithes from starving families. By attacking Canterbury, Tyler was striking at the heart of the system that kept peasants in chains. From Canterbury, Tyler's forces marched toward London, gathering supporters along the way. By June 12th, they had established a massive camp at Blackheath, just outside London. Contemporary chronicles estimate that Tyler commanded between 60,000 and 100,000 rebels, an army larger than anything the king could field. At Blackheath, Tyler was joined by John Ball, the radical priest whose sermons had inspired peasant resistance for years. Ball's famous question, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" challenged the very foundations of noble privilege. King Richard II, just 14 years old, initially tried to avoid meeting the rebels, but Tyler's forces were too large to ignore. On June 13th, the king sailed down the Thames to meet with the rebels at Greenwich, but his advisors, terrified by the size of the peasant army, convinced him to sail away without landing. This moment reveals the true power that Tyler had achieved. For the first time in centuries, the ruling class was genuinely afraid of their peasant subjects. The boy king's refusal to meet with them only fueled the rebels' anger. Denied their meeting with the king, Tyler's forces stormed London on June 14th. They opened the prisons, burned the palace of the hated John of Gaunt, and executed several high officials, including the Lord Chancellor and the Treasurer. But even in their fury, the rebels showed remarkable discipline. They didn't engage in random looting or violence against ordinary citizens. Their targets were specific: the instruments of oppression and the men who wielded them. Finally, on June 15th, King Richard agreed to meet with Tyler at Smithfield, outside London's walls. This meeting would determine the fate of the rebellion and of Tyler himself. Contemporary accounts describe Tyler as confident, even defiant, as he approached the king. He presented a list of demands that would have revolutionized English society: the abolition of serfdom, the reduction of rent to 4 pence per acre, and the execution of all traitors who had oppressed the people. The king, advised by his counselors, appeared to agree to these demands, but it was a trap. As Tyler spoke with the king, the mayor of London, William Walworth, suddenly struck him with a dagger. Other royal followers immediately attacked the wounded peasant leader, and Tyler fell from his horse, mortally wounded. The assassination of Tyler was a calculated act of treachery. The ruling class had realized that they couldn't defeat the peasants in open battle, so they resorted to deception and murder. With their leader dead, the peasant army began to disperse. King Richard, emboldened by Tyler's death, immediately revoked all the concessions he had made. The royal forces then began a systematic campaign of revenge, executing rebel leaders and returning surviving peasants to their former bondage. John Ball was hanged, drawn, and quartered. Thousands of peasants were executed or imprisoned. The rebellion that had promised to transform English society was crushed with unprecedented brutality. But Tyler's story doesn't end with his death. His rebellion had shown that peasants could unite, could fight back, and could genuinely threaten the established order. Though the immediate uprising failed, it planted seeds of change that would eventually grow into the end of serfdom in England. Tyler's courage in confronting the king face to face, his ability to unite thousands of desperate people, and his willingness to die for the cause of peasant freedom made him a folk hero whose memory the ruling class could never fully erase. Wat Tyler's story perfectly illustrates the central theme of our discussion. Peasants lived in constant fear because that fear was entirely rational. Tyler had seen what happened to rebels. They were tortured, mutilated, and killed in the most horrible ways imaginable. Yet he rebelled anyway because the alternative, continuing to live under the feudal system, was even worse than death. Tyler's story shows us that medieval peasants weren't passive victims. They were human beings pushed beyond their breaking point, who chose to fight back even when they knew the odds were hopeless. When we talk about medieval peasant fear, we're not talking about irrational panic. We're talking about the logical response of intelligent people trapped in a system designed to crush their humanity. Wat Tyler's rebellion and its brutal suppression proves that peasants had every reason to be afraid. Tyler's last words, according to some chronicles, were a defiant cry. "We are your equals!" In that moment, as he lay dying from the mayor's dagger, he embodied the spirit of every peasant who had ever dared to dream of freedom. His story reminds us that behind every statistic about medieval oppression, there were real people with real dreams, real families, and real courage. Tyler's rebellion failed, but his memory lived on, inspiring future generations to continue the fight for human dignity and social justice. The fear that medieval peasants lived with wasn't just about their own survival. It was about the knowledge that the system would crush anyone who dared to challenge it. Wat Tyler dared to challenge it anyway, and his courage cost him his life. But his story survived, and it continues to inspire us today. Historical sources. This account is based on contemporary chronicles, including the Anonymal Chronicle, Thomas Walsingham's Historia Anglicana, and Jean Froissart's Chronicles, as well as modern historical analysis by scholars such as Rodney Hilton and Christopher Dyer.